Hello, Susan said between wake and sleep as she struggled to make sense of a dream. Images first, still swirling within her head, confusing her. A dream married now to the noise of a nasty ringing, making it necessary to realize, slowly, that it was the phone that woke her. Susan, thank heavens. Susan, please, I need your help, a tiny voice said, immediately casting an image of a very small child. A child not more than 2 or 3 since it could talk. Although far too young for even a dialogue, let alone such big words. Who is this? Susan said, sitting up slowly as her free hand tried wiping sleep from her eyes. A futile gesture, knowing logically that her tiredness was behind those eyes. It would go away only when it was satisfied, not before, and, at this hour, it was far from being satisfied. Susan, please, don't hang up. It's me, Mark. Please, Susan, you've got to help me, the child said, pleading. Two forces rose within Susan, with both beginning instantly to oppose each other. One fostered by a child's voice clearly in distress, and another growing anger over being brought awake by a prank phone call. Listen, whoever you are, I don't appreciate wakening like this, and for your information, I've got caller identification. I know where this call originated from. You had better have a very good excuse ready for your parents, because I'm about to hang up and call them awake, Susan said, angry, but knowing enough that a child as young as this one sounded, was just on the verge of comprehension. Good, that's good, Susan. Call me back. I'll hold the button down and wait. At least that way you'll know it's me, that child's voice said, and added, please, cutie, please hurry, I'm scared. I'm so damned scared. Susan's mind reacted immediately. She was no longer groggy, no longer near the edge of sleep. Susan bolted upright, fully awake, her exhaustion vanishing in an instant of those letters, cutie, as she asked, who is this really? This sure as hell isn't Mark. Susan, it is me. It really is me. Susan, oh my heavens, Susan, I can't believe it, but it worked. The damn thing worked. Susan? Did you hear me? Cycloplast works. Hello? Susan? Susan, please. Please answer me. Please, Susan, don't hang up on me, I need you desperately, the tiny voice said against the logic of the words. Okay, that's it. How did you get that name? Susan asked, looking finally at the digital screen on her phone. It showed time, date, and the phone number of the lab. The lab! Susan was looking at the phone number of the lab, she realized, and that was impossible. Impossible, because no children were allowed. No one was allowed within the actual lab outside of her, Mark, and a half-dozen others besides security. Susan, please, listen to me carefully. It worked, Susan, Cycloplast worked. Don't ask me yet how it happened, but it happened. Susan, hold on to the edge of your sanity for a moment and listen. I'm massing, I estimate, at no more than 4.5 kilograms, give or take a few. Maybe 9 pounds at most, and roughly 20 inches in height, the voice said, and added, Susan, it took me half an hour just to reach the phone, so please wake up. Susan was suddenly sure it was Mark, and that thought, as simple as it was impossible. It couldn't be Mark, but it was, and the contradiction itself left her chilled and on the verge of shuddering. Mark? This can't be, Susan said, still fighting for the side of her brain that 1,000 scientists were in awe of. Mark's words, not his voice, proved he was telling the truth, and calling her cutie was really all the proof she needed. Only her father called her that, and Mark was the only other person that knew it. QT was her father's nickname for her as a little girl, changing over time to Cutie. Susan was 15 minutes from the lab on a normal day. She made it in 7. Morning, Dr. Emerson, Chuck said from behind the desk. He took a brief look at the contents of Susan's handbag as it passed through the X-ray machine while Susan passed through the metal detector. Her badge and thumbprint check gave her a green light and a door clicked unlocked. "Morning, Chuck," Susan said calmly, picking her purse up and passing through the steel doors. She was a sea of calm over that turmoil she felt. It was a short walk with 2 turns to the elevator, then 4 floors down to the bunker. They called it the bunker because it felt like that. Susan's badge got her access into the lab and, oddly, an eerie darkness. She wasn't expecting darkness. No one watched the hours worked, because scientists worked odd hours, so seeing Susan this early was hardly noticed. The guard, Chuck, went back to his magazine. Thankfully, there were no cameras in the cycloplast chamber room itself nor in the individual offices nearby. Mark took advantage of his size, darting this way and that till he had reached Susan's office. The offices were partitioned just at eye level, which thankfully meant no doorways. Mark used Susan's desk drawers as steps to the top of her desk before punching the numbers in. He used the conference button so he didn't have to move or lift the receiver. "Mark?" Susan asked tentatively. She wasn't sure what she expected to see, but the darkness made her nervous. "Over here, on your desk." "Couldn't reach the lights when they timed out. I'm way too small for the switch," Mark said as the lights came on under Susan's hand. Susan's brain was searching for the adult Mark when she stopped at the figure still below eye level. It was true, and that took only a second to register, but longer to grasp as Susan stood there looking at her desk, and on it, standing, was Mark. Mark, and not more than 20 inches tall. There was something else wrong as well, registering at the back of Susan's thoughts as she moved towards Mark, almost too afraid to do so. I know what's bothering you. I mean, besides my size, that is." "I think it's slump," Mark said, and added, "It's the only way I can describe it. I think, when I passed, gravity actually zeroed out. Remember, we talked about it when it happened to those oranges a few weeks ago. Not sure yet till I've looked at the telemetry and the gravity." Slump wasn't a very scientific word, but it did describe what Susan saw. Mark's body had filled out slightly, oddly in a roundish, chubby sort of way. It gave him a kind of fleshy, almost baby look, and that was unnerving since Susan knew the adult Mark at 6 foot even and nearly 200 pounds. Not a seriously buff guy, but not this at all. "What happened?" Susan asked. "An accident, and plenty of time to understand it, but not now." "Susan, you've got to get me out of here. When Schubert finds out what has happened, I'll never see the light of day again," Mark said. "Don't be silly, Mark, we've got to try and reverse this first," Susan said, standing there in utter and complete amazement. She understood totally the process she was looking at least in theory, but seeing it real, up close and real, took her breath away as she whispered, "It worked." "Yes, it worked. Listen, we can talk about this later and will, I hope, but not until I've established some sort of shield against Schubert and his security. Susan, physically I feel fine, and I don't think there was any changes mentally, so I can handle this for a short time, but for now we've got to get me out of here," Mark said. Schubert, Susan knew, was head of security now, and Mark, perhaps, was right. This was too fantastic to ignore. The world could not know about this, and there was no way they would once Schubert stepped into it. Schubert would never let Mark step back into the world given the changes he'd made. How? Susan asked, accepting Mark's assessment and logic of a totally illogical set of circumstances. Mark had shrunk. There was no denying that part of this, and still alive, and that too was pretty remarkable. Cycloplast had worked, and if that didn't beat all. Been thinking about that how part, Susan. Listen, as silly as this is going to sound, you can take me out as a doll. Maybe to your mother's place. Not sure where yet, but not my place. Look, once we are out of here, all I need is witnesses, a couple at most, and enough evidence to prove I'm real and still alive. We do that and Schubert is more or less stuck with me. Otherwise, Susan, I disappear and that's that, Mark said. Mark, Susan realized, was right about that as well, and going out as a doll was brilliant. Susan's dolls were the same size as Mark. Susan made dolls following in her mother's footsteps. Babies mostly and almost always using the Berenguer doll series for the basic dolls. Berenguer babies, because they were weighted, scaled proportionately and skinned softly, realistically, adorably. Berenguer dolls were as close to real-life babies as you could design into a doll. Actually, Berenguer doll craftsmanship and designs went back to the 50s and were second to none as far as Susan was concerned. There were still Berengers living in Castalla, Spain, where the dolls were made, and some were still sculpting dolls. Susan dolls, when she finished them, were nearly lifelike. Susan's dolls were works of art right from the beginning when you bought them. Remarkable and lifelike. The ones you used to create your own, the blanks as it were, took weeks sometimes to get that nearly perfect, almost realistic look. It took a long time to develop the skills to make a doll look real, but Susan had been making dolls for years now. Susan's skills, right behind her mother's, were remarkable since Susan had won a number of awards on some of her creations. Susan had taken several first places with her creations, and a couple of those winners and a new one she was working on sat on her shelf. The snicker came then. Susan couldn't help that slightly nasal snort. In spite of how scary this was, it was funny. Not enough sleep given the gravity of the situation, but still a little funny. I don't have any boy dolls, Susan said by way of a warning. I know, but it's not something I need to worry about at the moment. I've got to get out of here, and fast, and there's just no other way, Mark said and added, look, we can toss my things into the incinerator and that's that. At least till I've got time to plan something more long-term. Of course you're right. Okay, strip and I'll take care of those things, wait. Listen, Mark, Schubert is going to know you're still here or should be. He's going to go nuts looking for you, but the logs are clearly going to record that you've never left the lab, at least not by any normal means, Susan said. I know. I've thought about that. Okay, look, he's going to check the lab log and activities and see that I was running tests on force 4 levels. Logic dictates, since I'm not here, that I had an accident. It is going to be the only logical explanation, Mark said. As illogical as that sounds, Susan said. Susan, Schubert is not going to know that it worked. I'm really the only proof of that, Mark said and added, what I'm hoping is that at some point he's going to accept that I'm gone and list me missing, even presumed dead. That's when I can negotiate myself back safely. Security is going to record me leaving, Susan said, worried as she added, first thing Schubert is going to look at are the security tapes and he's going to see I've got a doll. That's just it, he's going to see you and a doll. He's going to see you taking home one of your dolls and nothing more, Mark said and added, you think he's going to connect me with that doll? Excellent. Okay, you are right. All security will see is a doll. Okay, go ahead and strip. I'm going to have to incinerate one of the dolls as well, Susan said, moving to the small workbench she used when she was painting the dolls. The ones she was working on were sitting on shelves above it. It was Susan's pastime, and working here gave her time to think when she found herself unable to. The small size, gas-driven incinerator was actually there to burn the organic test items they were using. Stepping back to different times meant you were also stepping back when viruses might be different. No one really knew, but no one was taking any chances either. In this case, it would destroy completely Mark's clothes and the doll. Susan spent a second choosing the one she'd be willing to lose. Actually, for Mark's sake she was willing to sacrifice any of their dolls, but there was a practical side to using her doll Penny. Doll making was an art form and the bearing a doll blanks were the best. The best, but artificial looking till the artist created the right colors for the skin, added hair, and then makeup. Not makeup per se but skin stains to duplicate facial color specific to how babies look. Special stains and special blends to give the face a real baby look. Doll makers were judged on how realistic their dolls looked first of all, then on what the dolls wore. OOAKs they were called or one-of-a-kind dolls, and a doll maker of any worth fashioned each doll exquisitely. Penny, Susan said. What? Mark asked as he was taking his clothes off. I'll use Penny. I haven't done her hair yet, Susan said. Which one? They've all got hair, Mark said looking at the dolls above Susan's workbench. Wig. I mean I use wigs on them first. Takes about 20 hours to add the individual hair to the head. Till then, I use small wigs and Penny is the only doll wearing a wig still, Susan said moving her hand to the doll she was talking about. All four of the dolls were baby girls and dressed to the extremes, but Penny's outfit seemed worse than the rest or in this case more elaborate. So too her hair, which Mark realized was what Susan would use on him. Had to be that one, didn't it? Mark said in a frustrated tone. It was most definitely a baby girl doll and very elaborately dressed. Sorry, Susan said as she carefully lifted the doll from its stand. Penny was designed to be a year-old baby girl doll and Susan had spent days creating the dress Penny wore. It nearly cost as much to make her dress as it might an adult's and most of that the lace. Susan's dolls were not dressed ordinary and the lace she used was imported from Italy. Penny was wearing a pink taffeta satin dress over a slip and the detail was elegant, the slip and dress were very dainty. An adorable baby dress and clearly the source of Mark's frustration. Penny's hair would be fine like a baby's when she was presented in competition, so the wig was too much hair and slightly out of character or age, but Susan liked her dolls with hair and that wig was cute enough for now. Panties I hope, Mark asked as he stripped his shorts off. He was now standing there, on Susan's desk, naked. His question asked only because the dolls on Susan's shelf were dolls that looked like babies. He was hoping they were not completely dressed as babies. Babies as in diapers and baby pants. Afraid not, and frankly that's a good thing. A diaper is going to hide the fact you're not a girl doll, Susan said lifting the dress from the doll. She knew what was under Penny's dress and smiled in spite of the seriousness of this whole thing. Now what? Mark said, not looking at what Susan held in her hands. First we've got to trash the doll and your clothes, then I'm going to color tint your skin before your makeup and lastly your outfit. Hopefully Chuck's not going to want to see you up close when we leave. Chuck never does when I tote a doll in or out of here. Makes him feel silly examining a doll. Hates looking under their dresses, Susan said as she continued to undress the doll. The incinerator was on the same floor but several sections away. The camera was behind her as she walked down the hall. Susan carried Mark's clothes and her naked doll to the incinerator but hidden by a box of printouts. With the incinerator it was also easier to burn papers than to shred. Susan was back in less than 5 minutes and picked up the airbrush she used to paint or tint the doll's skin. Susan used medical-grade cosmetics and coloring suitable for humans because it wasn't toxic. Same coloring and tints used in adult makeup, and she also decided to scent Mark the same way as her dolls. It would help with the illusion. Mark, do you by chance use any sort of hair removal? Susan asked when she returned. Me? Heck no, why? Mark asked as he looked down to where Susan was looking and added before Susan could answer, what the hell? Exactly, Susan said as surprised as Mark. Dead, Mark said looking at this nails as well. What? Susan asked. Dead cells? Not sure yet, but I've lost some layers on my fingernails as well, and that also explains why my skin feels so soft and smooth. Felt odd right after it happened. Don't you see, I've lost all or most of my dead skin cells. Hair as well as the top layer of my nails, Mark said. Okay, makes sense I think, and, believe it or not, that's going to work in our favor, Susan said. How so? Mark asked, running his hand over his head and wanting desperately to do the same with his genitals but didn't dare. He really didn't need to. You're going out of here dressed as a baby. Given that babies don't have much hair, it's going to work in our favor, Susan said and added, with that slight plump look and the clothes you are going out in, it's damn near going to look perfect. Doesn't make me feel better, Mark said. I guess it wouldn't. Anyway, first things first, I'm going to scent you, so close your eyes, Susan said. Susan scented her dolls so they smelled like babies or baby powder using a water-based baby powder fragrance. It was an expensive fragrance, costing her $12 an ounce. It was the same stuff Johnson & Johnson used for their baby powder and disposable diapers, and worth it. Ironically, Susan was going to actually make Mark look more doll-like rather than too realistic. That too would help fool the guard and the cameras when that time came. Hold your arms up and close your eyes. When I start spraying, turn slowly then drop your arms, Susan said, turning on the small compressor that drove one of several airbrushes. Ready, Mark said, standing on the pedestal that had only held dolls till now. If Mark was a doll, Susan would turn the pedestal as she sprayed. Susan began with an up and down motion as Mark turned. That took only a couple of minutes for 2 passes. Baby powder scent began to fill the air. Strong, Mark said of the baby powder scent that hung around him now. It will get less so as the overspray settles, Susan said. Now what? Mark asked, trying to ignore the fact he now smelled like a baby. Base skin color. I'm going to color you much lighter, then tint your elbows, hands and knees with a light pink blush, Susan said, picking up another tiny airbrush. Mark again turned around as instructed. Susan this time was carefully applying the base color. The tinting followed and Mark had a nice soft glow and even unblemished look. That reddish pink tint went on his elbows and knees and Mark began taking on the appearance of a doll. Makeup now, Susan said, turning Mark around so he was facing her. The brushes she used were delicate, very fine sable-haired brushes designed to work on the small doll faces. Right now that was Mark as she took up a small disc of color and moved the large magnifying lens with the surrounding fluorescent light above Mark's face. Washes off, right? Mark asked. Afraid not. Going to be a few times scrubbing before this all goes away, but by then you should be safe, Susan said. It would take an hour to get Mark finished. It was just a bit past 2. An hour would put them at 3 o'clock in the morning. She'd call her mother outside of the compound and go there first, Susan decided, as she again said, Okay, close your eyes and I'll do those first. Susan was an artist first and foremost, having painted since she was 5 in doll faces since she could remember. Mark's transformation, to Susan, was hurried and just okay. A stranger unaware of Susan's standards would have been mesmerized watching her work and seeing Mark's transformation evolve. It was just short of miraculous when she sat the last of her brushes down. Mark went from a kind of odd adult look to toddler to something more feminine to suddenly baby girlish as Susan worked. Ready, Susan said as she picked up the small baby diaper she'd had on her doll. No, Mark said, moving over to the diaper she had smoothed open. Susan favored the 1950s styles, and in those days mothers diapered their babies in cloth and covered the cloth in baby pants of one sort or another. Susan had copied patterns going back to those styles to fashion the doll clothes she made. Mark was about to wear a diaper once favored for babies from 1951 to 1957. It was tiny but real. Just take a second, Susan said, bringing the diaper between Mark's legs, now hanging and spread over the edge of a very large dictionary she was using as a platform. Mark ignored the feel of it, the panic over what had happened, and last, what was going to cover him. Electrical pulse, Mark said suddenly as Susan was bringing the two sides of his diaper together for the little diaper pins. They were pink-tipped plastic formed in the shape of a bunny rabbit sitting. Electrical pulse? From where? Susan asked as she slipped the diaper pin into the two layers of cotton she was holding together. Lightning! That damn storm over the foothills. All I can figure is it moved into the valley more than we expected, Mark said as casually as he might over lunch in a restaurant. He wasn't even aware he was being diapered at the moment, giving Susan cause to admire the scientist in him. He was looking so very cute and babyish. Even more than that, very girlish. Susan shook the thoughts from her mind. But what were you doing near the chamber in the first place? Susan said, gathering the opposite two layers of the front and back of Mark's diaper. I wasn't or hadn't been, but I saw a spike in the magnetic containment shield showing on the left and moved there to see if the chamber was okay. The spike itself was well within norms, so I moved there just to see what I could see. Stumbled then on that new cable they are laying. Didn't see it till I hit it and went forward. I heard the pop, and there I was suddenly looking at that same cable about 4 times bigger than what I remember it being, Mark said, lifting his bottom as Susan was tugging on the back of his diaper for a firmer, more snug fit. You could have been fried right then and there, Susan said as she pushed the second diaper pin into the two layers. Tell me about it. Only thing that saved me, which I think is the same thing that shrunk me, was that spike. Threw the system into shutdown from the overload, but not before it worked, and the damn thing worked, Mark said, looking off with a glazed look in his eyes. I still can't believe it. Honestly, I'm seeing it, but I can't believe it. It's almost like a dream or some sort of science fiction movie. I mean, look at you. What are you guessing, -3, say 3.5 or closer to 4, Susan asked as she tugged at the small edge of Mark's diaper, leaning then to pick up the ruffle panties Penny had been in. A least of 4. Not sure exactly, but I know we've never been past -3, which is why I'm guessing there was that spike, Mike said, trying to figure out, by his size, how far back he'd gone. Each point was 1,000,000 years. Each 1,000,000 years was divided by 10 points. 3.13 million years plus 100,000. Mark estimated he had gone back 4 million years. 4 million years? You sure? Susan said, sounding doubtful. 1 million, 2 perhaps, even 3 if they pushed, but 4 wasn't in the foreseeable future. That would need more power than half of the US got. Hello? Susan, look at me. Mark started to say when he suddenly stopped to see what he was putting his foot into, and adding as he did so, Susan, do you have anything else, perhaps something a bit more frilly? Sorry. Not here, but at home, Susan said, smiling and understanding Mark's sarcasm and being somewhat sympathetic, but she couldn't resist a little teasing at the moment. Susan had fashioned Penny's little baby panties, beginning with an old pair of pink Gerber baby pants for the authenticity of them. To those she added an expensive blush pink layer of lingerie nylon, and over that a very pretty blush pink opaque layer of organdy nylon. Touchable was the word Susan often used. The judges liked the soft silky textures, and so did she. Mark, she realized, might not. Susan paused with Mark for a second. She'd worked carefully on these panties, and they were special because of those efforts. There were 6 very delicate lace layers across the back, arrayed from the edge of the waistband to just at the curve of the bottom, and went from side to side where the panties' 2 halves came together. An exquisitely dainty and perfectly duplicated pair of a baby girl's fancy panties. She adored the tiny pink bow of ribbon she'd attached at the middle. Great, Mark said, then ignoring them again as he slipped his other foot into the openings before adding, anyway, it has to be at least that far back because of my mass and size. I'll need a few moments with a calculator, but I'll bet you, dollars to donuts, I'm within 1,000 years, give or take. Could be, but you realize that going that far back isn't going to be easily duplicated. Mark, do you know how much energy we'd need to hit 4 on purpose? Susan said as she tugged Mark carefully to a standing position so she could pull his baby pants up. Mark, at the moment, and for the time being, Susan mused, was just this side of a newborn to maybe a year-old relative to his size and shape. While he wasn't nearly as delicate as a newborn baby might be, he was still too tiny to be jerking around. Susan began to tug Mark's baby pants up. Don't you think I know that? Hell, why do you think I'm so scared? I mean, look at me, Mark said and added after a pause to look again at his panties, noted, never mind looking. Anyway, I've got this to worry about, and then there is Mr. Carl Schubert on top of it, Mark said as Susan finished tugging up and setting his baby pants in place. Schubert isn't going to shoot you any more than any one of us. He's no different than what's his name, the guy he replaced is, Susan noted as she fussed with Mike's panties for another moment. She couldn't help but adore Mike's new look only because of his face now so doll-like, feminine, and now looking very little girlish in those panties and diaper. Susan, they brought Schubert in for the additional security when we began shooting things back. Don't you remember? That's when the extra cameras went in outside and we got fingerprinted again for the new security system, Mark said and added, Schubert doesn't answer to the lab's director, he works for another agency and I'm guessing it's national. Okay, so we should be a little paranoid, but him rubbing you out doesn't make much sense given that you'd be a lot more valuable alive, Susan said, picking up Penny's baby slip and hoping Mark wouldn't notice. Valuable as something to study maybe. Susan, I'm not so worried about getting whacked as much as getting put away somewhere and no one knowing I've been put away there. You know, security risk and etc. 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 Mark said before pausing to allow Susan to add the slip. Susan had crafted this slip as if she was making it for a real baby. She, like most of the doll makers she knew, thought of their dolls as real, giving them names, fashioning unique looks, and most of all doing what mothers have been doing for centuries, by showing them off. Susan didn't simply sew together baby clothes as much as she fashioned them as delicate little works of art. Nylon underslip with a baby soft bit of lace. Over that layer the tulle for fullness, and over that a layer of taffeta to give the slip body and still feel silky. Each layer edged in lace with as much ribbon as they could carry. These were, after all, baby girls, and Mark unfortunately was now beginning to look very much like one. It was Mark's face and not just the makeup Susan had applied. That slump, it doesn't seem to take into account how much you have. Not sure how to say this, but you are far more chubbier, babyish than it seems you should be. We only measured the oranges at 3 or 4%, Susan said as she tugged Mark's slip down and around him. A baby's torso is disproportionate to a toddler's, and a toddler's slightly different than a child reaching puberty. A baby had a smaller, much shorter torso than an adult, and right now Susan was looking at Mark's body, deciding it was about as close to a baby's as was possible. For this costuming, as she thought of it, that worked out perfectly. For Mark, she was not so sure it was reversible. I know it is more, much more. I've been thinking about that, and clearly Sam's right about his space-time mass theory because I think I felt it. Was not long enough to say yes or no, but again, I am the proof. Those gluons we've been discussing are not there between the planes, which may explain why the planes merge but perhaps don't touch as we first thought. I think we actually lose our adhesion slightly when we pass through those layers. Only thing I can think of right now. I think this slump, whatever it is that we are calling it, gets worse the further back you go, and that is why I'm more chubby than I should be, Mark said, laying his hands down and suddenly taking note of the slip as he added, was this on the doll? I don't remember seeing it. What? The slip? Yes, it's a slip. Goes under the dress, Susan said as if Mark would know that, and added, as a diversion for Mark's sake while taking up the dress, if that is true, about those glue-ons I mean, it's going to limit our distance back with anything organic then. Definitely, unless we can quantify it somehow, adjust for it, and I'll bet with a little data on how far I went and the rate I'm at, Sam could figure out what that so-called slump ratio is, Mark said lifting his arms for the dress. You realize you could push this project a decade further ahead than it is with just the changes in you, Susan said as she carefully slipped the dress over Mark's head. Hell yes, I realize it, Mark said as the dress fell over him before he added, I am hoping that is going to be my leverage when the time comes. Given what I know now and what we can find out about what's happened to me, makes me one very valuable person. Trouble is it's a double-edged sword given what I do know and just as obviously given what's happened to me. Turn around honey, Susan said almost forgetting she was talking to the head of the lab at the moment and not one of her dolls as she added, strike that word honey part. Just don't call me Penny, Mark said turning down to see what he was wearing and groaning slightly. Mark was becoming the doll named Pen he added, even if I look like her. Mark's dress had very little waist just as babies have very little waist. The slip and dress were designed to rest just on the hem with the doll in a sitting position. With the doll standing, the dress and slip were too short to cover the ruffled panties now facing Susan. Mark didn't see the smile on Susan's face. Actually, Susan wasn't going to tell Mark that the dress and slip were split at the back right up to the wide pink sash and giant bow. She'd gathered each in her design so the entire layers of ruffled lace on the panties showed even when Penny was sitting. The slip's lace was just inside of the dress's lace so both layers of lace could be seen. Pure sugar and spice. Susan had designed them that way so Mark's little ruffled panties, or rather Penny's little ruffled panties, would show fully. Susan had won an award for this dress, slip and those panties and smiled as she wondered what those judges would do with Mark actually walking around on their table. Almost there, Susan said as she was closing Mark's dress with the tiny white pearl buttons. About time, Mark said for lack of something better to say as he looked at his fingernails. They were now a blush pink but pink nonetheless. Tiny little pink nails almost a tad bit smaller than the doll's. There. All that's left is your hair and shoes, Susan said picking up the wig in one hand while taking up the glue she used in the other. Mark was already bald so she wouldn't be pulling any hairs when the wig came off. It was a great glue with just enough adhesive to hold a doll's wig in place. Penny's doll wig, like all of the wigs Susan used, was made of human hair and this one adorably blonde, curled and nearly a perfect fit given Mark's size. It was reminiscent of Shirley Temple when she was 5 or so and just beginning to capture America's heart as Mark was suddenly with Susan's. So, is this going to get me out of here or what? Mark asked in that tiny childlike voice that now matched his looks. It was only the words that gave him away in those seconds that Susan stopped being a scientist and became something closer to a mother, causing Mark to suddenly add, "What?" "Nothing. Stop talking for a second. Illusion is in the details and we've only got one shot at this when we leave, so let me concentrate," Susan said. What Susan wanted was time to admire this little doll in front of her. He was adorable. A living doll both figuratively and literally, and Susan's by right, or so she mused. He was easily passable as a baby girl, as well, given his newly defined and so delicate features as Susan said, while fussing with his hair, before she added, "Perfect." "Perfect is a relative term," Mark said. "Exactly, and right now you make a very cute little baby girl. So let's get your booties on and get you out of here before I forget you're my boss," Susan said picking up the booties that had been on Penny's feet. Those booties were knitted in white with a light pink satin lining that closed with a delicate ribbon of pink satin. Each slipped over Mark's feet as if they were made for him, and with those in place he was as adorable as any of Susan's dolls as she added, "And that's that." Then let's go. The sooner I'm out of here the better, Mark said, pushing his arms out for Susan to take him up. It nearly made her cry seeing him this way, more so with that same gesture a baby might make to be held. If only he didn't talk, Susan mused, as she reached slightly to take him up into her arms. Susan cradled Mark in her right forearm as she might a baby gathering her purse for her shoulder in her left hand before picking up her car keys. Not a sound or a movement. I'm about to step into the cameras, Susan said, turning from her office but making one last check for any evidence that might hint that Mark had been there. Going to take any of this weekend off, Dr. Emerson? Chuck asked. It was just a few minutes past 3. Chuck didn't get off till 7 as he added, "Hey, she's cute." "Which one is that?" "This is Penny, Chuck." "Penny, say hello to Chuck." "She's going to my mother's house," Susan said as she added, "Do you need to see what she's got under her dress, Chuck?" "Not me, I don't look up doll dresses." "Wife might like to, she's into dolls almost as much as you are," Chuck said, pressing the button on the gate that allowed Susan to push on it as he added, "She'd love that one." "Heck, she'd like any one of your dolls, I'm guessing." "Anyway, have a nice weekend, Dr. Emerson." "Thanks, Chuck, you too," Susan said. "Stop," Chuck said suddenly as he finished jotting in the logbook. Susan froze then and Mark almost lost it suddenly. "Sorry, didn't mean to be so abrupt." "Just remembered Dr. Carter." "Say, you didn't by chance see Dr. Carter down there, did you?" "He's signed in at 8 but I'm showing him still in building," Chuck said. No, I haven't." "That's funny." "He was going to take one more run on the chamber then go home, or so he told me when I left earlier today." "Did you check the bathrooms?" Susan said, laughing, and added, "Most likely in there, sleeping with his pants down again." "No doubt. Reminds me of Brian. Brian, on swing, found him like that once. Scared the stuffing out of him that night." "I'll check when I do rounds." "Thanks." "You take care," Chuck said with a shrug. "Thanks, Chuck," Susan said as she pushed on the last door to the building but added as the door closed, "Don't move till we're in the car. That corner camera is shifting this way." Susan put Mark in the baby seat she carried specifically for her dolls. Her dolls were too expensive to leave laying or sitting on the seat, and it only made Mark cuter as she did so. Susan took a minute to fuss with his slip and dress before bringing the safety sling over and click it closed. "Okay now?" "Please," Mark asked, not daring yet to move but getting a stiff neck as he sat there. "Coast is almost clear," Susan said as she pulled out from the parking space before shifting forward. The gate guard, and she didn't know this one standing outside as she approached, waved her through just as she pulled up to the barrier and guard shack. Susan held her badge at her driver's side window, but it was clear he didn't need to see it as Susan passed and accelerated. "And we're out of there," Susan said, relaxing the moment she realized how tense she was. Mark, sitting stiffly practically since they left the lab, plus the not blinking, was in worse shape as he too let himself relax fully. "Thank the stars." "Okay, where to now?" "Your mother's place, right?" Mark said. "Mother's place and some time there to come up with a plan," Susan said as she looked at her gas gauge. It had nearly been on empty when she'd left her house, with it now almost scary as she added, "But gas first." Meanwhile another car had eased in behind them, back a ways, but matching their speed. Tracy, the driver for this shift, began to work herself into a role. She was or would be a housewife. Still a bit early, but yes, a housewife, she mused, pulling into the gas station, but opposites of the pumps where Susan's car now sat. The call on her cell phone came as she was pulling into the pumps. Tracy confirmed there was a doll in the car. She thought the director of security was going mad when she closed her cell phone. Tracy mused again as she realized she might have a shot at Mark, and she was still trying to comprehend all that she was told. She was clearly looking at a baby girl, she was sure of that, but then again, as impossible as it might seem, she wasn't. Her boss didn't joke. "I'll be right back," Susan said as she opened her door to the light chill of early morning. Tracy couldn't believe her luck as she watched Susan walk off. Tracy opened her cell as she opened her door. A voice answered immediately on the other end as Tracy said, "I'm going for him." Neither Susan nor Mark noticed the woman or the large black SUV when they pulled in, but Tracy now noticed the baby. A girl baby and not, and Tracy was shocked that the mother, even a pretend mother, would leave her baby even for a second. Only you would leave a doll, but that doll had just turned her head towards Tracy. Tracy got goosebumps. Tracy was suddenly nervous, knowing full well the reason, as she edged between the pumps to look directly into the open sedan and the baby girl now looking at her as she whispered, "That can't be a man?" "Shit," Mark whispered to himself as he sat there wondering what baby girls do when they look or are looked at, as he added in a whisper, almost a whimper, to himself, "Come on Susan, where are you?" Susan was looking at the attendant in anger in those seconds. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, it's not our machine but the lines. They said they'd be back up at 6 this morning." "I'm really sorry," the young attendant said as he added, "I can take a check if you like." "It's going to have to be a check." "I don't have enough cash," Susan said, putting her credit card back in her wallet and taking her checkbook out. Damn this paperless society, she cursed in her thoughts as she found the first blank check in her book. "Thank you, and again I'm sorry for your inconvenience," the young man said as he finished taking down Susan's driver's license and phone number. Susan felt it first in the pit of her stomach, then in her brain. Mark and his car seat were not there in the front. Susan looked, she looked hard and then felt faint, sick and suddenly panicked. Mark was gone. Tracy drove fast, but carefully and just at the speed limit till she was a few miles away. She'd been watching the mirror and after a time slowed. Anyone out this time of day and anyone with a baby girl dressed the way this one was probable cause. Tracy looked over in amazement. "It's going to be all right, precious. Mommy's here. Mommy is never ever going to let you out of her sight again. You're safe now, my angel," Tracy said as she sped off down Highway 7. If that was a man, the way she talked would confuse him, and if it wasn't, it would calm the baby. The banks didn't open till 10, Tracy realized. She would need cash. She'd hide in a parking lot first. No, the baby needed clothes. Clothes, food and diapers, she reasoned, as she looked again in her mirror. She looked over at the baby girl and her brain fought the same battle as before. That was not a man. Mark was in a panic even worse than before. He wanted to scream out for Susan back there, but didn't dare, fearing he'd give himself away. He felt helpless as the woman ducked into Susan's car and quickly undid the belt, freeing the seat, but not him as she tugged both past Susan's door. It happened so fast that Mark just sat there. "My baby," Susan cried loudly, then fell silent. That was stupid. It wasn't her baby. It wasn't her doll. It was her boss, and somebody had taken him. Only she wasn't sure what to do about it suddenly. "Ma'am? Ma'am, are you okay? Did you say baby?" the young man asked in a panic after running outside when Susan had screamed. "Can you call the police?" "No. Wait. No, it's okay, never mind that. It's okay. Honestly, it's okay," Susan said over and over again, almost mumbling to herself. Mark wasn't a baby, but a man. Albeit a very tiny man, but still a man. Mark had his wits and intellect, and Susan needed time to think. She didn't need the police. "Ma'am, are you sure?" the young man asked, feeling very odd about this whole scene. Clearly the woman was distraught and she had said baby, but now suddenly, she was fine. The young man nodded and backed away before turning to walk back inside. He caught Susan's license and jotted it down along with the make and model and Susan's description before picking up the phone. 911, state the nature of your emergency, the woman's voice said. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" "I'll bet you are, Mommy is." "We're going to stop, honey, but Mommy needs to drive a bit more," Tracy said, moving her hand to the baby's pretty face. A pageant mom would dress her little girl this way, Tracy thought, given that the little girl looking at her was absolutely adorable, and that dress. That dress was to die for, Tracy also thought, touching the cute bit of lace that circled it. Adorable. Tracy was sharp, deciding to cross the border north, go just far enough, then turn around again and backtrack. There was 2 separate groups of border guards. If there was an alert out, the border northbound would be the first alerted, and only the northbound cars would be subject to any search for a baby. They would remember Tracy and the baby in a car going north. That way they would have a false trail, and that would give Tracy more time. She wasn't going to lose this baby. This baby had to be the most valuable baby on the planet. Tracy could not bring herself to call her a man. Captain Tyrrell Spritz went code 3 as his computer flashed the information that was also coming over his radio. Possible kidnapping, child, baby girl, and only 10 blocks away. No description of the child or kidnappers, and then a comment that it might not be, as Spritz slid easily into a fast right turn. "She just left," the young man said as Spritz walked up to the gas station attendant. Spritz got the information he needed and moved back to his car and radio. Sounded domestic. Mother panicked, then went calm. Most likely the husband taking the child, but that still made it a kidnapping if the husband didn't have custody. Spritz radioed the information and waited for the woman's car to be sighted. 12 other patrolmen were also now on alert. That alert hit the border just as Tracy was now heading southbound again. No one at the border crossing south paid any attention to the woman and child they waved through. Time was crucial. Spritz knew that, as did the other patrolmen. They also knew that a car, traveling at freeway speeds, could gather up a lot of miles in a few short hours. Meanwhile, Walter's Supercenter was open 24 hours and had nearly everything, and Tracy was 4 hours past that point of no return now. Mark was wet but couldn't help it as he sat there listening to this woman babble on and on with her damn baby talk for most of the drive. Mark hadn't a clue on what to do about this, so for now he could only wait for when the opportunity came. He'd bolt then, he mused, and laughed. Mark laughed, but to himself, because a 1-year-old baby girl running down the street in a little pink dress and ruffles was going to attract about as much attention as him full size and wearing the same exact things. Mark sat quietly, uncomfortably, in his wet diaper, watching in a detached and fascinated way the view he assumed a child got while in a store. He was in a shopping cart facing backwards. Tracy had enough faculties to move slowly, casually, and not attract any more attention than necessary. Mark's dress was too frilly for that time of day. For Mark, this was not exactly something he'd do even if he had the chance, but the academic in him was fascinated while another part was a little less scared. At least he was out of that lab and the reach of Schubert. Mark played with his skirt and slipped, chewing on the hem a little, hoping it was what babies did. "Baby dresses?" Tracy asked of a saleswoman who smiled at Mark before telling Tracy which aisle. "That is such an adorable dress," the saleswoman said. "Grandmother's," Tracy said, and added, "My mother loves to sew." "Enough said," the saleswoman noted, laughing as Tracy pushed Mark and the cart off. "Here we go, my sweets," Pretty dresses for a pretty little girl, Tracy said as Mark found himself a foot, maybe a foot and a half below a sea of baby and girlish toddler clothes. Dresses mostly frilly or sweet. Too damn sweet and way too frilly, Mark mused. Ma'am, Tracy asked of a woman fixing little dresses on a rack. Good morning and welcome to Walters. How may I help you? The young girl asked, looking at the baby girl and smiling. She is soaked and, believe it or not, I've walked out of the house without her diaper bag. We're on our way to see her grandmother. I'd like to buy a dress, fresh diapers and get her changed and then shop. Can I do that? Tracy asked. Of course. How sweet she is. Tell you what, get what you need, give me the tags and I'll staple them to a bag so you can continue to shop, the young girl said, moving a finger to Mark's cheek as she added, Are you wet, precious? She is so cute. She is my angel and thank you so much, Tracy said as she tugged a little dress from the rack. Pink, but at least it didn't have as much frills as the one Mike wore. His panic grew again when he realized that this woman was going to discover he was male and not female. Right through that aisle, another saleswoman said when Tracy asked for a restroom with a changing station in it. Tracy had found diapers, a pacifier, powder, oil and baby wipes that she had the sales girl ring up and put into a new diaper bag before searching for the bathrooms. Why, you're a baby boy, precious, Tracy said the instant she pulled open Mark's wet diaper. The changing station was in a large stall that could be closed and locked, and Tracy had done so. The restroom had been empty when they walked in. Mark was positive that this bit of news was going to quickly change the woman's mind. He was sure he was being kidnapped, and since that was the case, he was also sure this woman wanted a girl. The fact he was a boy baby might very well get him released. Your other mommy is just like me, isn't she? Babies don't care how we dress them, they just want to be loved. If that bastard of a husband had understood that, none of this would have happened. And that State Department, as useless as breast on a man. Well, never mind all that now, honey, mommy is here and you're never going to be taken from me again, Tracy said as she sat Mark up to remove his dress. This woman was as mad as a hatter, Mark decided. Susan was on the verge of tears. Frustration at the moment, and nearly 30 minutes now since she'd been pulled over. Officer, I'm trying to explain that it was a doll. Look, I'm not married, see? No ring, and just me on the registration, Susan said as a third police car pulled in behind the one behind her. The other was in front, and all of them with lights still on. There was no kidnapping, and yes, someone had taken a very valuable doll from her, Susan had noted. Most everything Susan said checked out, and the officer taking the information seemed satisfied and promised to put the doll into the system, but it was petty theft at best, and there wasn't much they really could do about it. All 3 patrol cars remained where they were as Tracy pulled back onto the road for her mother's house. As Susan pulled away, the policemen gathered together. There was a little laughter over the fact that it had been a doll. They had gone code 3 for a doll. Schubert, meanwhile, was poring over the logs, and Chuck, the guard, at that moment was sweating bullets in a room next to Schubert's office. No sign of that scientist, Mark, and the guard hadn't gotten suspicious? What the hell were they paying him for? Schubert had asked before hitting the alarm that put the center on full lockdown. The security sweep began at the lowest level of the building, working its way back up, and in a sweep like this even a mouse was at risk of getting caught. There was only 2 possibilities since Mark was nowhere in the building, and one of them was the incinerator. The other that machine. If Mark had gone by way of the incinerator, he was history. If Mark went through that machine, he was also history, but something else as well. Schubert shuddered a little, remembering a couple of scenes in Star Trek when guys didn't make it from one place to another using transporters. Those guys always ended up as something else and dead. Dr. Allison, one of the scientists in Mark's group, confirmed it was the machine when he showed Schubert the computer logs. There was definitely mass, and it was definitely organic, that went into the chamber, Dr. Allison noted 6 hours later. He confirmed that with another doctor, then both went quiet as Dr. Allison dropped his head and said, "Damn, that's a nasty way to go." Schubert agreed that it was horrible until he was alone. When he was alone, he gave a sigh of relief that there was no breach of security on his watch. Just some dumb scientist making a dumb mistake. Schubert pushed his key into the lock below the buttons and coded in an all clear for the building. Schubert already had Mark, or would have. Doors that were locked, unlocked. Chuck, the guard, was free to go and keep going. That video surveillance of Susan taking the doll from the building was just what it appeared to be, a woman and one of her silly dolls. Schubert took a look around his office, picked up his jacket and left to gather up as much of the weekend as he had left. At least that's what he wanted it to look like. Schubert had another video system and he had watched Mark become Penny. There was no way he was going to not put cameras into those labs when he took over. Mark was in another pink dress and slip under that. Although he was wearing a disposable diaper this time under a new pair of ruffle panties, those, he mused, with fewer rows of lace ruffles. Not as frilly as his last outfit, but frilly enough. Breakfast had been a bland-tasting cereal from a baby food jar and a baby's bottle of whole milk. Mark tried watching where they went after leaving the store, but had fallen asleep in his car seat not too long after his bottle. Tracy, as Mark slept, was closing a deal on a very nice station wagon. Mark, when he woke, was looking out of a car bed in the back seat of a different car. Tracy, Mark decided, had lost a few $1,000s on that trade, at least, but it was a smart move changing cars. Mark was wet again and, to his horror, about to become poopy. There was nothing he could do about it as he sat there in his car seat fighting back what he couldn't fight back. Susan, meanwhile, sat in frustration trying to decide again how to explain this whole thing to her mother. "Mom, let me try this again." Okay, when the universe exploded, what people call the Big Bang Theory, it began instantly to flow outward in all directions and at the same time. It's been flowing outward ever since. Since time began, and that was billions of years ago. Some think about 20 or so. Anyway, the universe is expanding, cooling and changing into planets and stuff, then a few billion years later we arrive. Now we are quite a ways away from those origins, but there are scientists who believe that every moment since then is a plane of existence called the space-time continuum. Some also believe, since this is part of that space-time thing, that we can actually look back in time. In a way we can, since what we often see is the light of things that existed millions and millions of years ago and are now gone. More importantly though is that a few scientists began to believe we can actually go back. Other scientists believe that if we were to step back we would, of course, step back to when the universe was smaller. Step back a little and the universe is only slightly smaller. Step back a lot and the universe is much smaller still. If you are the one stepping back you grow smaller, proportional. As it happens, that man my boss works for figured out, through some very complex math, that the rate of shrinking is relative to the amount of time backwards, Susan said, pausing. But honey, I don't see what this has to do with you losing a doll, Susan's mother said. Right, and I'm not doing a very good job of explaining this, am I? Susan noted, paused again and began to say, okay, let's try this then. Honey, I'm sure this is all very interesting to someone, but it still doesn't explain why you're so upset over losing that doll, Susan's mother Carol said. Mom, you're right. Okay, for now ignore the science of this and just understand that tonight, or rather last night, it worked. Mom, it worked, and last night a man went back through the space-time continuum about 4 million years and survived, Susan said and added, and when I saw him, that first time, he was 20 inches tall and weighed about 9 pounds. What? You're kidding, Susan's mom, Carol, said in a mild state of shock. It wasn't something she could grasp fully, but she knew her daughter did, and she trusted her as she added, Who? Mark, Mom. Mark, my boss, Susan said as she began to cry lightly. Susan's sobbing grew more silent, but more intense, and suddenly Carol caught on as she added, Wait? Are you telling me that Mark? No, that can't be. You're kidding, right? Tell me you're kidding. It wasn't Penny, the doll, that the woman took, but Mark. Are you telling me that Mark was in Penny's clothes? As the impact of that hit Carol, she went silent for a time. Honey, we've got to find him, Carol added suddenly. Trouble is I don't know how, Susan said. Meanwhile. Hello, Carl Schubert said on the third ring. It was his private line, as he recognized the coded number following the phone number. Carl pushed a yellow button on his own phone to scramble his side of the call. It's me, Tracy said into the payphone. I know, Carl said smiling as he added, So, did you get him? Yes. Got lucky when that woman Susan stopped for gas. Clearly she's not a mom. She left him sitting in his car seat with her door opened. Grabbed him and split, Tracy said and added, I've changed cars, moved around a bit, and I'm pretty sure I haven't been followed. Excellent. Okay, settle in and I'll set up a meeting with Susan first, then with you and Mark, Carl said as he added, Oh, and is he as small as he looked getting dressed in the lab? It's pretty remarkable. Hard to believe, and I'm seeing it. It's like looking at a baby, and he's as cute as a button, Tracy said. You've kept him dressed that way, as a baby girl? Carl asked smiling as he tried visualizing the man, so masculine, now in ruffles and lace and, of all things, being kept in diapers. He thinks he's been abducted by a crazy woman, so he's afraid to speak out. I was going to say something to him, but decided it's better this way. He's quieter. It's a whole lot less complicated keeping him as a baby girl, Tracy said and added, So what about the locals? Anything new? Locals, right. Okay, they think it was a doll that was taken, but don't count them out yet. I think they suspect it's a husband-wife thing and that Susan, as the wife, is afraid to report the abduction. Anyway, things are quiet now, Carl said, motioning to his deputy director with a hand as he added, I'm going to start the ball rolling ASAP. I'll wait to hear from you, Tracy said as she hung up. Tracy looked off in both directions before she began to walk back to the room she had rented. Mark was just starting to wake up. Tracy wrinkled her nose and Mark blushed crimson. Well, poopy pants, let's see how bad you are and then get you into a bath, Tracy said, lifting Mark's dress and slip after she turned him over. She was tugging his disposable open to look from the back. It was another act of humiliation feeling his diaper and ruffled pants being pulled open like that. Worse still was knowing what this woman would find. Meanwhile, Chuck, the security guard, couldn't believe he was in Baja, and on a fishing boat of all things, and for 2 full weeks besides. All paid for by his boss's boss, Carl Schubert. All he'd been told was that they were going to pretend to fire him and then fly him down to Baja for a couple of weeks on the agency. Chuck's reward for a job well done. It was Chuck's reward, his boss said, for that heads-up he gave them when Susan walked out of the building with her boss Mark. Chuck had caught Mark's eyes move when he'd called out for Susan to stop as loudly as he had. There was something about the doll that didn't set right with Chuck in the first place. Looked too much like a real baby and not a doll. Schubert, thanks to Chuck's silent alert, had a car waiting on Baker Road by the time Susan reached the main gate. For nearly a year now, Schubert had put a car on the outside at the ready for his command. Mostly if something should happen, and with Chuck's alert it had. That was why everyone had orders to let the woman alone, which was why the gate guard had waved her through. As complicated as everything could have been because of Mark's condition, his attempted escape actually now made life simpler. Much simpler, ironically. Mark dressing as that doll was a stroke of genius, and it now made things even better from the security side of it. What made it funnier, for Carl, was Agent Tracy Bourne leaving Mark that way. Carl snickered as he picked up his cell phone to call Susan. Meanwhile, Tracy was laying out Mark's things, beginning with a fresh disposable, wipes, his baby oil, powder and, of all things, a tiny light pink soft cotton sleeper. Mark was on his back and took the light pink and white pacifier Tracy teased against his lips. Mark hated his dirty diapers, so, conversely, he was glad he was being changed. Ironically, he was also getting used to being changed. Those scented wipes, the care Tracy took in that baby powder was soothing, comforting, and only got better when the diaper went between his legs. Even the ruffles and lace had an affect on him. Mark smiled behind the pacifier. "You are getting used to this, aren't you, my little man?" Tracy mused as she tugged at the tapes holding Mark's diaper on, as Tracy added to herself, "And so am I, precious." Mark felt the humiliation of a blush beginning at his neck and rising to his forehead as the smell of his dirty diaper reached his nostrils. He couldn't help it, clearly, but it didn't help make him feel better as Tracy pulled him gently up by his legs to carefully ease his soiled diaper out. This was trashing Mark's ego badly, those dresses, and now this being treated like a baby. Only not. There was another side of him enjoying some of it, a lot of it perhaps, as Tracy took up a baby wipe, then another. He had been bathed, powdered, fed and dressed, and best of all loved, or at least nurtured with a great deal of warmth. Can't ignore that, he mused, and wondered if this was typical of mothers or just this Tracy being Tracy. Tracy Bourne, the oldest, had grown up with 5 brothers, and ironically the youngest, when he came along, became her doll. A girl doll, since she often, when she had the chance, used her own baby clothes on him. She was 11 when Jeffrey was born. She had to share her room with the baby, so it was only fair he be, in a figurative sort of way, a girl baby. Mark was many things for Tracy in those minutes she took to clean him before the baby bath in the large bathroom sink. For baby wipes, his Johnson's baby bath in the hotel sink was both soothing and just as amazing. He was still having trouble with the whole concept of this and realized he had every right to. The baby powder scented baby bath left traces of memories, deeply rooted, in Mark. He wasn't sure where those memories sat, and there were no images for a time. Then a few that came as occasional flashes of something. Something almost like a momentary touch. More baby powder, but not before a very wonderful pat down with a very soft towel. There was definitely some pleasure in this, Mark mused. "You are so sweet, precious." "Yes, you are," Tracy said as she rubbed Mark with the baby powder, using far more than was necessary. Although more would have been nice, Mark decided, when she stopped. "Pink is for girls and sweet little boys," Tracy said in a motherly voice, taking up the diaper with a band that read "Pampered Princess" in a light pink script. A lightly screened image of Cinderella was visible on the front of the diaper, leaving little doubt it was meant for a girl. So too the sleeper in a soft pink cotton that she carefully eased him into. Mark's pacifier was huge in his mouth as he nursed. That surprised him when Tracy had teased it between his lips, and he missed his teeth terribly. They were there, he could feel them still, but only nubs now. Like his hair, his teeth were gone down to the living part, since the dead porcelain and enamel had gone the same way as his hair. At first Susan had said it was an advantage and Caps would fix that when the time came. However, his missing teeth gave him a baby's mouth and little to eat with. Of course, what Tracy was giving him to eat didn't need teeth, and he missed terribly a little salt and pepper. Gerber wasn't big on salt and pepper in their baby foods, he noted. "Is my sweetie hungry?" Tracy said, picking Mark up after closing the zipper of his pink sleeper. He felt warm, comfortable, smelling strongly of baby powder. Tracy sat at the hotel table, by the window, to an open jar of Gerber's strained beef and carrots. "Definitely needed more salt," Mark mused as he took his first bite. Mark, in a plastic bib with pink flowers covering it, was sitting comfortable in Tracy's arm, taking each bite happily because he actually was hungry. Yes, there was something to be said of this whole process, Mark mused, as his small stomach filled. "Susan," Carl Schubert said after her hello as he added, "It's me, Mr. Schubert, Carl." "What can I do for you, Mr. Schubert?" Susan said cordially, coolly, tainted some with a small amount of contempt in her voice. She, like most of the scientists, had a strong dislike for administrators and, most of all, security. In Schubert's case more because Mark's fear was grounded in what Schubert could or might possibly do. "Susan, it's about your doll." "Penny, I think you called her," Schubert said. Susan was struck terrified in that instant mention of Penny's name, wondering first how Schubert knew that name, what he knew of her doll, then more fear that he knew it all. "Yes, what about her?" Susan asked, forcing herself calm. "Susan, we're going to need to meet and talk, alone." "Breakfast? Perhaps that place you like going to with your mother?" "Say in 30 minutes, Schubert asked. "And why do we need to meet and talk, Mr. Schubert?" Susan asked, realizing he knew more than she thought he did. "For Penny's sake mostly," Schubert said nonchalantly, but making it very clear the reason. He knew. There was no question of it now, Susan mused, and tears filled her eyes. If he's been harmed, so help me," Susan said, feeling the tears of anger well up in her. Susan, please? I don't know what you think you know of me, but I most certainly do not have any intention of harming your doll. On the contrary, I want to bring her back into the scene, as it were, so you and she can continue your work. Good heavens, you and she have done something truly remarkable, and to waste that would be criminal, Schubert said, softening his tone. You keep saying she, Susan said, feeling only a tiny bit better that Schubert realized Mark's importance and that Mark's future, at least for the moment, sounded slightly more safe as she added, "Can I see him?" Susan, I'm using feminine pronouns for her sake at the moment, and I can explain that over breakfast, and of course you can see her. It's just that I need to take care of some minor security issues with you and her before this can come to a close, Schubert said. Half an hour, Susan said. Mark woke wet but comfortable in the baby girl's disposable diaper and cotton sleeper, looking at the sides of a netted portable bed he was sure he could climb out of if he chose to. That ability to escape left him feeling somewhat better, having at least a little control over his destiny. The fact that he hadn't was simply because he had no plan on what to do once he climbed out. The hotel door handle was a feat beyond him, and the world now at least 4 times bigger. Big day, precious, lots to do. Come on, my little princess, and let's get you dressed, Tracy said, looming over Mark. She was already dressed. Tracy had cuddled him after his dinner and vanilla pudding dessert before the bottle she nursed him to sleep with. Tracy had taken her dress off, but left her slip, panties and bra on. Tracy was a striking woman, and Mark's desires, as a man, were countered by Tracy's treatment of him as a baby, and he went to sleep terribly in conflict. Mark wore one of his princess diapers, as he thought of them, under yet another little baby slip and what seemed like a never-ending supply of frilly baby dresses. His diapering more comforting than not suddenly, but he guessed it was just him wanting out of the wet one. His slip comforting as well in an odd sort of way, and those lacy ruffled panties embarrassing at best. So too the dress, again. Mark had never thought of the term sugar and spice and everything nice till now, till this third new dress was going over his head. It was white but offset in feminine ways by pink ribbon strips that circled the dress, the very high waist and around his tiny arms. White and wispy, or at least the first layer was, the second you couldn't see through, and most likely satin. It fit nearly perfectly after Tracy fused first with the skirts and slip before those few buttons in back. Remarkably, the glue holding his blonde hair on seemed waterproof, then worrisome if it was permanent only because it might hurt trying to get it off. Tracy used a baby brush for the baby fine blonde hair, adding a hair bow that used Velcro rather than a clip so the bow would stay on. A silly kind of feel since he couldn't actually see it once it was in place, and with his pink bow in place she finished with his new shoes. White baby shoes reminiscent of Mary Jane's and in a size 1 according to the box. The lace socks silly looking since they were on his feet. Choosing a station wagon was also a good idea, Mark mused, as Tracy carried him into his car seat. The back of that wagon now held a lot of furniture and accessories, and just for him, most of it, making it remarkable you needed that much gear for someone so small. It was the new baby carriage that unnerved him when Tracy opened it. White and pink with a kind of see-through top, but satiny as well, and way too many pink bows to suit him, although one was one too many. Tracy had said they had lots to do today, but here they were in the middle of park, made prettier because of spring. Mark was in a sea of pure femininity when Tracy started pushing him along the rows of flowers. Mark's heart froze, and he actually wet himself a little when Tracy slowed his baby carriage alongside a park bench. Carl Schubert's face sat just slightly above Mark's and was smiling. "Hello, Penny," Carl said, bending slightly to bring a finger under Mark's chin. Mark was beside himself given how he looked, and that looked worse when Tracy had replaced his bow for a ruffled and lace-white bonnet, matching the dress. She had added that before they started into the park. Carl, when he spoke, was actually fingering the satiny bow that held it on as he added, "I really like the look, it suits you." All sorts of things went through Mark's thoughts, not the least of which Carl's words. Those words and the realization that Tracy, now standing off to the side near the edge of the small lake, most likely worked for Carl. It meant that everything she'd done had been in context to knowing he wasn't really a baby. Twisted, Mark decided, looking down at his dress, then the glimmer of silk panties pushed out by his diaper. "Quite an adventure you're having. Would love to share with you your thoughts on what it's like being treated as a baby girl," Carl said. "Would love to help you realize this dream of yours," Mark said in an odd-sounding voice, no longer needing to fear getting caught. Mark hadn't talked for nearly 2 days and nights, and finding it difficult after letting the pacifier he was nursing fall to the end of its strap clipped to his dress. "Yes, I'm sure you would, but right now we've got some things to worry about, and the first is this terrible breach of security you and Susan have caused. Fortunately, your choice to leave the compound as a baby girl was excellent and has left a lot of the holes you left opened, now closed. Unfortunately, it's opened a few more we can't close very easily," Carl said. Mark explained his reasoning, and most of all his fear for doing what he did. Carl was again surprised given what they thought of him, but understandable as well. Too many movies and always the agency the bad guys when, in fact, it was the agency that took care of the bad guys. Carl got Mark past a lot of that by reminding Mark, as he had Susan, that their discovery still needed their contributions. An accident, and Carl believed that, was still a long ways off from duplicating what had happened. Although, Mark was, along with Susan and her work, co-founders of a very great discovery and his value, incalculable. It was, to say the least, one of the oddest conversations 2 men had ever had, considering one of them looked very much like a 1-year-old baby girl. "Maybe 2 years old," Carl said, trying to boost Mark's morale a bit. Which brought Carl to another issue, a critical issue given Mark's current state and the likelihood of that not changing for a time. Mark, still resisting some of this greatly, added another small twist of irony to that conversation, there in middle of the park when he asked Tracy if he could be changed. It was one thing, Carl mused, to be interrupted by a phone call or something like that, but a diaper change was a first for him. For Mark it was nice, because he no longer had to make faces since Tracy would know what he needed as he said, "I'm wet." "No baby talk," Mark warned as Tracy folded back the ruffled white hood of Mark's baby carriage to change Mark's diaper. "Promise, but you're going to have to forgive me if I forget," Tracy said, pulling wipes, baby powder and a very cute diaper from Mark's new diaper bag, and, like most of what Tracy had gotten for him, it was in pink. Mark was wet but not poopy, and Mark warned Tracy about that word as well from now on as he comfortably looked up at the trees overhead. Tracy, as careful as always, wiped him, added baby powder and another diaper meant for a baby girl. Mark even tolerated Tracy fusing with his dress and bonnet before moving him, still within the confines of his carriage, back to the bench and Carl. Carl wanted to say something, to comment on what had just happened, but held back. There were more important things to consider, and Carl really was worried about Mark's safety. He was also worried over what he thought as the only solution. Carl, while Mark was being changed, had watched the park with a jaded eye, looking for the people the agency had identified as agents of their newest allies. However friendly Russia was, it was still Russia, and while the Cold War might have ended, stealing state secrets was still cheaper and faster than research and development. There was a tacit agreement reached when Mark began feeling comfortable with Carl's view of him as still a contributor to the project. There was another odd moment that caught the eye of a jogger when the two men shook hands. Mark had stood holding onto the hood of his baby carriage to take Carl's hand, and the scene really was as funny as it looked. Susan picked Mark up as she would a baby she was seeing for the first time. Those looking on believed what they saw, and what they saw was an aunt or dear friend of a very pretty young girl named Tracy with that adorable baby smiling. Mark, for the most part, was tolerant of Susan's greeting simply because it was practical. He couldn't touch his hands around her neck, but he did hug back. There was an uncomfortable moment when Susan noticed the ruffled panties because they were new, but those, Mark made it clear in a whisper, were not by choice since Tracy had been dressing him without his input. If it were up to him, he noted with a laugh, he would have picked something with more lace perhaps, but not the ruffles. It always sounded so funny, that baby's voice sounding so adult and being so sarcastic. Susan, Tracy, Carl and Mark all met again at Carol's house. Carol was still having a hard time believing Mark was who he said he was, sitting there in a new high chair, but left it alone as she fixed tea for the adults and a small sippy cup of tea for Mark. His hands were too small for a teacup. The agreement reached was for the sake of everyone, and when they did break up, a new plan was in place. It wasn't perfect, but it was a plan. The announcement went in the paper that following day. Mark wore a black velvet and white satin dressy dress over a slip above white ruffled tights and shiny black patent Mary Jane shoes. Tracy, holding Mark in her arms at the funeral, wore a simple black dress with her face under a netting of lace, as did Susan and her mother. Those wondering over the young girl and her baby had been told Tracy was Mark's younger sister, others were told she was Mark's lover and the baby girl his. No one knew for sure, but, again, that was Carl's intent. When they all came together that night, it boiled down to Susan's mother as the only one, outside of those working for the agency and company, that knew Mark wasn't a baby girl, or Penny as he was now being called. Of course, Susan's mother had been playing with dolls for most of her life, so adapting to Mark, as almost a doll, was far easier for her than even her daughter. Carol would miss that adorable young man, she said, but she now had a kind of granddaughter to sew for. Within hours of Mark's funeral, and as part of the plan, he and Tracy disappeared. Carl, with a careful eye, was now satisfied enough watching the interplay between Mark's new surrogate grandmother and Susan, as his new aunt, to forego anything other than monitoring. A few wiretaps and a microphone here and there would take care that part, and did within a couple of hours of Carl's request. The jet Mark and Tracy flew in was owned by the agency. Meanwhile, Mark was now in Europe and would be while the lab, back home, got back into its routine. Even Chuck was back, nicely tanned from his vacation, and at his station. He was there that first morning when Susan came in to begin work again. Susan, now heading up the lab in Mark's place, made it clear to her staff that Mark's accident, as tragic as it was, would not be in vain. Within a week of Mark's funeral, everyone was nearly back to normal and working to duplicate Mark's experiment. Even Mark was happy a few days before he was taken to the hospital. It was wonderful seeing Europe, although he'd have preferred seeing it outside of a baby carriage. Mark did like the attention, and he admitted that to Tracy, who finally asked why he was smiling so much. Mark would not admit it was his dresses, nor the diapers. The rest was only a tiny bit more complicated, but necessary, and most of the reasons Carl had originally picked Tracy to come into the picture that night of Mark's attempted escape. Trouble was, Carl argued, the world had seen Mark now female and as a baby. There would be medical checks, school exams, even possibly accidents to cover over the next few years, and too risky not to. Too much risk leaving him male for the next couple of decades. Mark for the first time in his life cried, and did so for almost as much time as Tracy had so many years ago. One crying sadly over a loss, the other, remembering, crying happily over what she had gained. Mark, when Carl talked with him, could understand the logic of it, in an odd sort of way, but getting used to it was going to take time. Lots of time, and Carl made it clear Mark could have as much time as he wanted. Mark took a number of weeks before he finally signed his consent. It made sense, and there really were very few other options. Fortunately, Tracy was there, as she always was, when Mark's tiny body was wheeled into the operating room in Denmark. Nowadays, and while SRS operation were lengthy, it was all done at once. As always, the surgeon taking up the scalpel, looked down and smiled. That doctor once told a fellow surgeon that she absolutely loved turning young men into girls. Under her knife the boy was about to go, and a girl would arrive soon, as she began by creating a space between the rectum and prostrate. An incision posteriorly between the anal area and scrotal ridge was first, the surgeon said to Tracy, who nodded and smiled behind her surgical mask. Tracy knew exactly what was happening to Mark. With some repositioning, Mark was told, a natural vaginal cul-de-sac, called the Douglas space, would be created. With a widening of the surgical field, Mark's tiny penis would be cleaved and lightly repositioned before being sutured and closed to become Mark's neovagina. All of this under anesthesia, Mark was promised. Tracy was there to answer Mark's questions, and did. All of them. Tracy now sat in a mixture of fears, not the least of which a mother's waiting for the surgeon's words announcing her little girl Penny okay. It would be the first time that Penny would physically be a little girl named Penny. Penny born, using her newborn identity, would be, according to the papers Tracy held, legally Tracy Bourne's adopted daughter. As far as the world would know, Penny was a little girl actually named Katrina, taken as an orphan from war-torn Serbia to a hospital in Denmark where Tracy, a transsexual herself and barren, had adopted her. Ambiguous genitalia was written as the necessity for SRS. As far as U.S. Customs would be concerned, it was a very happy mother returning from Europe with a brand new adopted baby daughter. Much of it, with no small amount of irony, was true. At least that part about Mark being a brand new girl now. Tracy and her new daughter Penny left after 7 days in the hospital. There was some minor complications, and aspiration was discontinued, and her urethral catheter was removed for management of Penny's new vagina. Retraction had to be held for a time so that Penny's newly placed urethra stabilized. Penny's urethra did finally stabilize, and Tracy, as happy as any mother with a newborn, diapered and dressed Mark as a baby girl for the very first time as a baby girl. Tracy, with a very happy Penny in her arms, greeted Penny's new sponsors Susan and Carol at the airport. It was a tearful reunion with no one truly acting. Even Carl was there holding a very cute and very pink balloon for Penny, who walked awkwardly but convincingly, given the thickness of her cloth diapers, ruffled panties and a slight bit of tenderness, out of the airport. That had been Carl's one last concession to Mark before Mark's consent to change his sex. Mark wanted to come back a 2-year-old at least and walking a little. Talking as well, although Mark agreed to use broken sentences and only a few big words around strangers. Carl consented only because Tracy would be able to tell, whoever asked, that Penny had been born malnourished and thus very tiny for her age. Penny, under the circumstances, was reasonably happy for the trip to her new home. Although she would deny, a number of times, that it was from the attention she got. Attention by almost everyone from the time she left the hospital to that moment she was taken up and hugged by Susan and Carol. She was, to those who knew her, now Penny. She was also Penny to everyone outside of the Bourne household. She wasn't, however, to those who read her memos, saw her calculations, or acted on her suggestions and recommendations at the lab. No one knew who was consulting, but there was someone very smart at the other end of that computer. All they knew, in that lab, was that it was stranger wishing to remain private. A brilliant stranger that guided them through some of the steps they needed to take to duplicate Mark's original experiment. They did know, those working directly on Cycloplast, that this new consultant was at least as smart as Mark had once been. Some speculated smarter and possibly Russian, but again no one really knew for sure. That too was thanks to Carl. Arranging for Penny to continue working had some minor problems, some of which in securing her system. Securing a computer so it wasn't picked up electronically is difficult at times, but not for Carl. A tight-beamed laser proved safest between Mark's new home and the lab. Given the size and wavelengths they used, it was nearly invisible. Given Penny's size and her persona for the world also made things somewhat unique. Mark was still a brilliant scientist, but watching a toddler in a frilly dress and Mary Jane shoes writing complex formulas on a Sesame Street blackboard often made Susan smile. It also made Susan laugh when Penny, known to Susan for so long as Mark, was at her workstation. Actually, Penny's workstation was a computer built directly into a cleverly designed Hello Kitty toddler-style school desk. Thanks to the agency's technicians, it was impossible to tell it was a sophisticated computer when Penny was drawing or playing and not working. Laughing over this was what got Mark past so much of it, and Susan's laughter seemed constant. Like discovering that Penny herself was always insisting on dresses rather than shorts or her onesies. Susan knew Tracy was the one influencing that part of Penny's transition. It was several months later that Susan understood completely that influence of Tracy's. "Takes one to know one," Tracy said one evening as she diapered Penny for a few more minutes with Auntie Susan and Grandma Carol. As always, there was a new dress to be tried on. Odd as well that Mark was still wearing diapers at night, but no one questioned why. When Tracy confessed, it surprised Susan to know that Tracy had once been Terry, a man. Tracy had once been Terry, one of the best field agents in the greater metropolitan area. When Terry Bourne requested the opportunity to transition to Tracy Bourne, it was Carl Schubert himself that gave her the okay. Sharing this with someone, already through it, made a great deal of difference in Penny's life, and Carl knew that. Mark's life, his past life, fell slowly into the background. So much of that because of what Mark wore over those months, and much of the reason Tracy had kept him in such pretty dresses for most of that time. "It's how my mother helped me transition over those years growing up," Tracy said of her past as she added with a shrug, "Mother always wanted a girl to help around the house with the other boys, and, as it happens, I was the oldest boy." Who would have thought, Penny mused on the eve of her birthday. It was all about Berenger babies and the Big Bang, she whispered, nursing her bottle, in her Barbie castle bed just after Tracy put her down. Tomorrow was going to be the second biggest day in her life, giving that she was going to step, once again, into the cycloplast chamber. They, the group and that consultant, whoever they were, had discovered some things in the past 12 months solving the riddle of that spike they thought had been lighting killing Mark. It wasn't lighting, but a newer sun 4 million years younger when Mark had stepped back. 4 million years younger and slightly more powerful than the one shining on Mark in normal time. They had also discovered the reason for Mark's slump when Susan found him standing on her desk looking so much like a toddler that night. It was the near absence of dark matter that allowed his atoms to gather slightly closer than they had been, and that too was now known. A phenomena that occurs between the planes of that space-time continuum. Bring the planes together, closer, and you lessen the amount of time between them, and as it happens, that slump. What wasn't known was if Penny would actually grow from that original point and look a year older than she was when she returned. That was the second deal Mark had made with Carl that day before he agreed to become Penny. The deal was that each year, given that cycloplast worked, Penny would be allowed to step in and step out again. Step in a 2-year-old and out that first time at the age of 3. Next year she'd be 4 and the year after that 5. Each year a step into the chamber and a year older. Roughly 400,000 years less each time they estimated till Penny looked old enough for high school or college. When she looked old enough, Penny could work once again directly at the lab and carry on Mark's work, almost as Mark, almost. None of the scientists or lab technicians knew who the person was that would step into the chamber that night because they were not allowed to be there, but some speculated that it was the consultant and clearly a Russian. Tracy was there obviously, and so too Susan. Carl as well after shutting off the security cameras and computer logs. Penny wore a new dress for this occasion, a little girl's party dress in a pink chiffon made even better because Susan had sewn it. A suitable dress for a soon-to-be 3-year-old on her birthday. Perfect for the trip Penny was about to take as she handed Tracy her Hello Kitty purse before stepping on the platform. "It's almost time, Penny," Susan said, as the turbine's whine grew louder. There was the smell of ozone in the air, faint and getting stronger as the rift in front of Penny grew. "Now," Susan said looking at the dials, and Penny took a step forward in her shiny black Mary Jane shoes. "Behringer babies and the Big Bang," Penny hollered in that adorable tiny voice of hers before she twinkled slightly as she met the rift shimmering around her. She was there, she was gone, and she was there again. The twinkling leaving everyone to wonder if it had actually happened. Happy that Penny was still standing there smiling when that snapping, crackling and those popping sounds ended. Carl saw that it had worked. Carl had a better grasp of details and Penny was almost an inch taller now. Slightly less babyish in her cheeks and smiling. Carl smiled back first, then the two women joined in. Susan laughed and clapped her hands together. Tracy laughed as well, tugging something from a bag, and then Penny laughed. Tracy was holding up a bag in one hand and a pair of "I'm a big girl now" training pants in the other. Diapers still, but at least these Penny could pull them up like real panties. It was the ruffles that made her smile as the 3 candles were lit. All 3 of the adults began to sing, "Happy Birthday to You." They sang that song the same way each year for nearly 17 years. Penny sat at her desk in a continuous flood of very happy tears as she went through the album her mother had made for her. It was the eve of her graduation from college and very late after a wonderful party. Papa Carl, now retired, was there with Aunt Susan, also retired, and, for a short time, Grandma Carol. 5 photos on each page and 2 pages for each of those 17 years together was what Penny was crying over. 170 pictures taken out of the hundreds her mother had snapped over the years as Penny grew up. All of them of Penny, beginning with her birthday each year. Each year looking slightly more grown up. Tomorrow, at the age of 18, Penny would graduate top in her class. Top and with honors to become the first student ever to walk away with a doctorate in applied physics in just 4 years. Even more remarkable, Penny had started collage at 14. Penny already had a very exciting job offer from a company under contract with the Department of Energy on a new project she couldn't talk about. Thanks to Carl's rumors, Penny was going to follow in her father's, Mark Carter, footsteps. Penny told those still working at the lab that Mark was her father and, of course, she was a baby when he died. For those who had known Mark, it was clear to everyone that Penny had a lot of Mark in her. She was as brilliant as he had been, perhaps more so, some mused. A few were actually convinced that Penny was Mark's daughter, as one woman noted, "You can see it in her face. She looks a lot like I remember him." "You were such a girly girl growing up," Penny's roommate Helen noted as Penny worked through the pages. "Is there any other kind of girl?" Penny said, laughing. "Did you ever wear pants growing up?" Helen asked as she bent down to give her roommate Penny, an occasional lover, a comforting hug. The dresses in the pictures were exquisite and terribly girlish in all of them, thanks almost always to Aunt Susan and Grandma Carol. "A few times, long ago, but I hated them," Penny said, laughing as she hugged her lover back and added with a snicker, "started wearing dresses as a baby." "That's when we all started wearing dresses, silly," Helen said. "True, but I always felt very special in mine," Penny said as she added, "same with the diapers." "Speaking of which, come to bed, we've got a big day ahead of us," Helen said as she moved to bed with the large thick white cotton diaper she was about to pin on her Penny. Penny had met Helen right after starting collage through a forum called Betty's. Penny loved being babied and Helen, as it happened, loved being a mommy. Penny looked over at the diaper Helen was laying open and smiled. She smiled more as she slowly closed the album. On the front, surrounded by pink lace, was a picture of a Berenger doll in a cute little pink dress. Penny's first dress, as she lovingly ran her hand over the picture. Below the picture, Penny's adopted mom, Tracy, had carefully written in a glittering script, "Berenger Babies and the Big Bang."